Jim is back. I haven't left yet. We're certainly pleased you've arrived at the Big Bid Theory, and I might add, so I will, a special edition of TBBT. Jim, first of all, welcome, and how was your trip to San Diego?
It was pleasant. It was pleasant, Bill.
What did you do?
I was working, first off.
You're always working.
I'm always working, exactly, precisely. No, I did some surfing up in La Jolla, saw some old friends in Tijuana.
Did you run into Bill Walton?
I didn't, but you know what's a great story? I actually did at a Grateful Dead concert once. It's not hard to miss him, right? He's
6'11", yeah.
Redhead, too.
Right.
But nice guy. So
you said redheads. You didn't say ginger.
No, it's a touchy subject with me. Let's just drop it.
Okay, well, I said it a moment ago. This is a special edition, no extra charge, by the way. With 4th of July next week, God bless America, I'll be visiting potential partners over in the Windy City. I'll be going up to Chicago next week, and yes, catching a Cubs game.
Jim Cubs!
Jim will be being Jim. We know what that means. Yoga, hanging out with Willie, not as Willie hanging out, not golfing though.
No.
What else will you be doing for the 4th? I know you're a cookout hot dog.
Kayaking and kayaking and kayaking. So look for me in a river near you.
The longtime listeners of the show know that we like to keep things light, airy. We like to keep things smiley. 3 out of 10 dentists recommend our show's attempt at humor. Jim, it's time to change gears a little bit. If there's a more serious topic than terrorism, I'm not sure what that would be.
No, I totally agree. This interview with Dr. Clarke is just so phenomenal. Terrorism, one thing I wanted to add, that there's a quote from Stalin had always stuck with me. It's always stuck with me since like undergrad maybe, but it was his definition of terrorism, which if you know anything about history, you know, he did it very well. The easiest way to gain control of the population is to carry out acts of terror. Yeah, I mean, just little pieces here, little pieces there, but basically the ability of the, few to enact terror on the many.
Think of the lifespan of this podcast.
Hold on. Okay.
2 podcasts ago, we visited with Jake Durr from the City of Austin, Homeland Security, Office of Emergency Services. We released the podcast the very next day the shooting in Orlando happened. I visited with Dr. Clarke in preparation, more on that in a moment. 3 days later, the shooting at the airport in Turkey.
With the Orlando situation, I have so many questions. I could go on for ages. I mean,
we have a guy with answers.
I know. Oh no, totally. I mean, it's tragic, but even those words wilt under their intent.
Actually, so here we go. Actually, this is part 1 of our 2-part visit with our next guest. He's going to go through his background, but Dr. Colin Clarke from the RAND Corporation, also University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, is a renowned, known universally as an expert on terrorism, author of Terrorism, Inc. You've heard him on the radio, seen him on television. As a matter of fact, talk about crazy. Dr. Clarke was on Turkish television literally when the bombing occurred yesterday. You talk about chills. I see experts on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and sometimes I wonder, what makes you an expert? What motivated you to be interested in XYZ? Our visit with Dr. Clarke begins with Dr. Clarke answering the question, why become one of the world's leading experts on terrorism?
I'll give you a little bit of a background of how I got involved in studying terrorism in the first place, if that's okay. I was actually in Ireland. I was at the National University of Ireland, Galway, for a study abroad semester there specifically to study the Provisional Irish Republican Army. This was in the fall of 2001. My first actual day of class was 9/11, and so it was pretty symbolic that I'm there in Ireland studying, this ethno-nationalist terrorism, and then all of a sudden the world is, awakened to terrorism from Salafi jihadists. And so I kind of went back to my apartment. I'm from a big family of U.S. Marines, and so emails and phone calls started flooding in. Hey, what's going on over here? And I had to be completely honest. I didn't even know where Afghanistan was on a map. I mean, I generally knew it was in Central Asia and that it was possibly landlocked, But the only thing I knew about Afghanistan was that it was the first country that popped up on a drop-down menu when you went to order something internationally. But it wasn't really in the news a whole lot, and I felt ignorant, and I felt ashamed, because here are my family members that are in the military saying, hey, you're a college guy, you're studying this, what's happening over there? And I really had no clue. And so I kind of, from that day forward, decided that I was going to dedicate myself and my career, and it's really been more than a career, it's been pretty much my life, to studying, Salafi jihadism, Pakistan, Al-Qaeda, and all of the kind of offshoots since then. And so that's what initially launched my foray into the study of terrorism. And so I kind of left behind the IRA and started looking at AQ. A couple of years later, I went to graduate school at NYU, where I continued my studies, and then I think it was my first class in graduate school. I was studying a course called the Contemporary Middle East, and I was just like, this is for me. I want to do this for a living. And I thought initially I wanted to become, an academic. And so I talked to one of my professors, and he said, look, if you want to, become a college professor, you have to go get a PhD. And so I determined very early on in my master's program that, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go get a PhD. That led me to the University of Pittsburgh, which then led me to the RAND Corporation, where I've been for a little bit over 5 years, focusing on terrorism, violent non-state actors, insurgent groups. And so I never, I got into the research side of things, and then I'm also a professor. I'm a lecturer at Carnegie Mellon University and a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where I teach everything from international organized crime to the financing of terrorism to U.S. grant strategy. And so I'm able to kind of scratch that teaching itch as well, working with undergraduate and graduate students there. Along the way, I spent 3 months in Afghanistan working with Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Shafafiyat, which is the Dari or Pashto word for transparency. So it was kind of a counter-corruption unit that brought together all sorts of different experts and military folks to look at what we were calling at the time criminal patronage networks, or CPNs, to use the acronym speak. And these were the kind of confluence of Afghan government officials, Taliban fighters, drug traffickers, and warlords. And in Afghanistan, sometimes that could all be one person. So figuring out, what these folks were doing and how we could, help counter them.
Yeah. So, earlier this week, Dr. Clarke, when you and I spoke, and we all know 9/11, what that means in terms of terrorism being front and center in front of so many people. Well, when you and I spoke earlier this week, and I mentioned that once upon a time, back in the mid-'80s, I was stationed over in England, lived about an hour and a half north of London up the A1, and I remember, my friends, my associates and I, when we would go to London, our concern was, being stuck at a pub that maybe unfortunately would be targeted by the IRA. The Brighton hotel bombing happened about a month after I was on the ground in England. But I guess my point was, terrorism, maybe back in the mid-'80s, if you interviewed 100 Americans, how many would in the mid-'80s would understand what terrorism really was? Here we are in 2016, and I suggest that a far higher number of people would know what you meant when you said terrorism.
Absolutely. I think for Americans in the 80s, the threat was the Soviet Union. We were in, it was the Cold War. It was the threat of nuclear warfare, and terrorism was considered largely a nuisance or something that happened elsewhere. And even where it did happen, it was primarily ethno-nationalist groups, so groups like the IRA, or groups like the Badr Meinhof group, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, or the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, and so, or the FARC in Colombia. We weren't really focused on groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, even though it was around 1984 when Al-Qaeda's predecessor organization was being formed, and as many of the listeners probably know, Al-Qaeda is really an outgrowth of what happened during the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989. So the group was metastasizing during the 80s, but at the time that was a conflict that the United States was supporting the Mujahideen because our greater enemy at the time was the Soviets.
certainly the landscape has changed exponentially. Now, terrorism, you and I could speak for days. Obviously, there's so many different moving parts when it comes to terrorism. You in particular have some background on the financing of terrorism. It's I'm sure it's been difficult for terrorist organizations to hold on to their key assets, especially a non-centrally run organization like ISIS. ... Dr. Clarke, what are the reasons for the rise in terrorism? And I guess the obvious appendage to that is, what are the key factors at the root of terrorism?
Yeah, that's a great question. If it was only that easy to answer, we know that there is no silver bullet, that all of these groups result from a confluence of different factors, and it's the same thing, or much the same with radicalization. People say, well, how did this individual or group of individuals become radicalized? Is it poverty? Is it religion? Is it, another country's foreign policy that's driving into this? And it's often a basket of factors. But I'll talk a little bit about the kind of basic overview of the state of terrorism. I think particularly the United States is at a critical juncture in dealing with the challenges of terrorism and violent non-state actors. Although admittedly one would be hard-pressed to identify a period in the past 3 decades when that statement was not true. But the current cacophony of instability and violence in the Middle East in particular, within this kind of broader Sunni-Shia civil war that's playing out, it can truly be described, I think, as unprecedented. Given this volatility, I think projecting the future of terrorism and violence is a precarious undertaking, although that's often what we're tasked with doing as analysts and political scientists. But I'd say, we're looking at a different flavor of terrorism than, as you mentioned, what we looked at in the 80s or even the 90s. We've got ISIS. We've still got Al-Qaeda and its affiliate organizations, including Nusra, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. We've got the threat of lone wolves. I think certainly we'd have to admit that social media has been a game changer in terms of its ability to radicalize, spread the ideology, and attract foreign fighters. And then we've got incidents that are taking place outside of declared battlefields. So we've got Paris, Brussels, San Bernardino, Orlando. Terror seems to be ubiquitous. And you can no longer escape terrorism by simply avoiding places like Times Square, right? I mean, San Bernardino happened at an office park in a fairly nondescript California city. Orlando was at, a gay nightclub. Paris was all over the city, and ditto for Brussels. And so I think it's pervasive, it's widespread, and it's almost amorphous in a certain sense.
Yeah, and that's one of the more scary aspects. You just touched on it, Dr. Clarke. Again, when I lived in England, a different time, a different place, terrorism was different. But I can remember, at times people would say, stay away from Trafalgar Square. Don't go down Piccadilly Circus during X period of time. Now, where do you not go?
I don't, my mom will call me up after one of these terrorist attacks and say, oh, should I not go somewhere? And I say, no, live your life. These aren't things that, have common sense, right? And keep your head on a swivel and be aware. But that's good advice in general, right? To avoid pickpockets or crime. I mean, I'm from New York. I've been following that mantra my whole life, when I go into New York City. And so I don't think it should be any different now that we're faced with the prospect of terrorism.
You just mentioned a moment ago as well, and it certainly piqued my interest. You mentioned how social media is playing a part in terrorism. Here at Bid Prime, obviously we're monitoring government purchasing activity, and we did a report back in April on measures that governments are taking in terms of procuring services and solutions, counterterrorism, countermeasures, and there was a request from the state of New York for social media threat monitoring software.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think today when we look back after the fact, right? So a lot of people, when they talk about counterterrorism, they talk about London as having CCTV, right? Or, they have all these, televisions, which is great after the fact to see who did something. But now when we're talking about a threat, as we saw in London on 7/7/2005, when we're talking about people that are willing to kill themselves in the process, finding out who they are after the fact is good, but it's not going to be a preventative step. I think with social media, some people refer to it as OSINT, open source intelligence. We've got to get better at monitoring these threats in real time, because sometimes you can see people devolving, you can see their mindset deteriorating, and they're using social media as a platform to espouse fairly radical views, where in retrospect people look and they say, oh wow, here was this, quote unquote fairly normal person, whatever that is, that all of a sudden became more religious, more anti-American, and then threatening violence, right? But sometimes that's not identified until after the fact. And so I think getting better at figuring out, who is more likely to commit violence is a major initiative that we all need to take more seriously, including, at the local, at the state. You mentioned New York State, and at the federal level, but also, to communicate. We live in a borderless world now.
Sure.
Although I'm kind of reminded of maybe that's not so true with the Brexit vote this morning. That but it's true. I mean, with globalization and the ease of crossing borders, we need to be able to communicate with our allies across the pond as well.
So, Dr. Clarke, you bring up a couple of good points, and there is a lot of activity when it comes to use CCTVs as an example, collecting evidence after the fact. In the past decade or so, do you believe the U.S. intelligence community, do you think there's been more of an emphasis on signals intelligence compared to human intelligence collection? And if so, is that a good thing?
It's tough to say. I mean, a lot of that stuff takes place behind closed doors. I think what I would advocate as a policy prescription is to focus on both, right? And I know that's kind of unrealistic in certain respects because we're faced with finite resources, right? So to say do more of everything is not really realistic. But I think we've got to be comprehensive, and so I think we've got to look at human intelligence. I think we've got to look at signals intelligence. We've also got to realize the limitations of both those platforms, right? So in a place like Syria, it's notoriously difficult to get good human intelligence assets just because it's so complex, it's so chaotic on the ground. And so that might be a place to rely more on other forms of intelligence. But I think we've got to approach this, comprehensively, and not just looking at one form of intelligence and realizing that there is no silver bullet, there is no one source of intelligence or one technology that's going to lead us to the promised land. It's actually an across-the-board approach that's going to be more likely the recipe for success.
Another note on that, and again, Dr. Clarke, appreciate you joining us now. Sometimes we'll see government purchase requests also for predictive analytics software that's used by law enforcement or finance and tax enforcement. Are there any new technologies, tools, or softwares, big data, any of those items that you've heard of that are currently being deployed to help in the aid in the battle against terrorism?
I think there's a lot of promise, but again, I think it's just that at the moment. I hear the term big data bandied about quite a bit, but I haven't seen anybody explain to me how big data has been used effectively in counterterrorism. Now, maybe that's taking place, and I'm unaware of it. That's certainly possible. I think there's a lot of promise and potential out there, but you have to remember, for all these new technologies that emerge, things like drones or UAVs, or a lot of people have talked about 3D printing, that same potential exists for the terrorists as well, right? And so
sure.
While 3D printing could help cut down on the logistics tail for the military, it might also be able to help a jihadist group print out bullets or weapons. So I always, and I guess this is just my cynical, pessimistic mindset, people talk about all the promises of globalization. I always tend to think of the dark side or the sordid underbelly of globalization, right? So, the Internet's a great place because it helps researchers collaborate and develop 21st century medicines. Well, I think, it's a place where pedophiles and terrorists can go on the dark web and plot and plan and meet each other. My wife often tells me, wow, you've got a pretty sick mind, but if you did what I did all day and read about these things and all you were thinking about were potential threats, you'd probably think the same way.
Looking at your background in preparation for our visit, I thought to myself, how scary would it be to know the things that you know? And we just kind of touched upon it. And as I prepped for the interview, Dr. Clarke, I thought to myself, are there people out there who, when you talk about Al-Qaeda, when you talk about ISIS, their reference is maybe Mark Wahlberg in Lone Survivor, or
possibly
is it stuff that they see in the movie theater? Because you just touched upon it. Terrorism groups, they have access to a lot of financing. They have access to a lot of technology. In your book, Terrorism, Inc., you refer to the gray economy as it pertains to the funding of terrorism. What is a gray economy?
Yeah, so the gray economy are all those kind of quasi-illicit avenues that terrorist groups can use to raise money. So think about charities, think about front companies, think about things like fraud, right? So they're not necessarily illicit on their face, but when used the wrong way, when you apply for social welfare benefits, when you apply for a mortgage, all of those things can be used to then gain access to funds that can be used to commit violent or nefarious acts. Charity is much the same. When you look at the conflict in Syria, there are a lot of organizations out there right now collecting funds for medicine and other things. And most of them are probably legit. I think the overwhelming lion's share are. But there are a few charities out there that are then collecting those funds and doing other things with them. And I think we've got to be very conscious of that. We've got to be very cautious. But again, that it should be treated on a case-by-case approach. When it comes to things like fraud, I've looked a lot more recently since the Charlie Hebdo attacks, since Paris, at the kind of micro side, right? So how these kind of jihadist criminals in Europe are financing attacks with much smaller sums of money, because you can do that with $10,000 or less, and so they're doing it by simple acts of drug dealing, theft, petty crime. And I often say, and I said this once as a joke, but it's really several people have asked me about it since, and it's a serious point, which is, if you're taking out one of these loans that you plan to default on to use the money for terrorism, if you're planning to martyr yourself, you're not exactly concerned with your credit score.
That's a good point. Kind of scary. We're talking about financing here. So what's the primary commodity that terrorism that they're using as currency? You mentioned drugs a moment ago. Is it weapons? Is it drugs? Is it gold?
It's
is
everything.
It human?
So there's no, that's another challenge in countering these groups, is that they diversify their portfolios, and so it's the smuggling and trafficking of all those things you mentioned. It's drugs, it's weapons, it's humans, it's, as we've seen with ISIS, it's oil and antiquities, right? So anything that can be trafficked, sold, or smuggled, they're involved in it. They've got their hands in everything. There was a report a couple of weeks ago from a British newspaper saying that ISIS is making money from fish farms, right? So seemingly banal activities, they're going about and they're finding ways to make money. And then your other mafia-style activities, right? So things like extortion and protection payments, bank theft, which we've seen ISIS partake in, and the like. And so these groups are highly adaptable. They're constantly evolving. And once we're able to shut down one source of revenue, they simply switch to the next.
Jim and I will share part 2 of the interview with Dr. Clarke on our next episode of the Big Bid Theory. Dr. Clarke will reveal one of the things, Jim, he'll talk about is who concerns him the most when it comes to terrorism.
That was the most fascinating thing, I think, from the entire interview, and I don't mean that as like some cliffhanger because I really don't care, but seriously, I love that part.
That episode should hit the streets around July 14th. Incidentally, get Terrorism, Inc., as I said during the interview, some scary stuff, but info we'll all better quickly get a grasp of. Dr. Clarke is on Twitter as @Colin P. Clarke. Get Terrorism, Inc. on Amazon or work with your local bookseller. Jim, what concerns you the most about terrorism?
I think it's kind of so broad of a question
Sure.
these days. It's kind of like, how does a fish describe the ocean? I mean, it's all around us. So commenting on it is trite almost, unless you're affected by it, which I've never been. So I can only speak of it hypothetically. therefore I don't even feel like I'm owed an opinion. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it does, man. Can I tell you what concerns me the most about terrorism?
Please.
Is I am concerned that the leadership, not just in this country, but I'm talking globally, the leadership throughout the world doesn't have the fortitude to address the problem.
Most definitely.
Talk about abruptly changing gears. We segue from terrorism to crazy bids. Jim, I learned something new virtually every day. Since Time Immemorial. Talk to me.
All right, so welcome to Crazy Bids that you can win, or I can win, I don't know you, but boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. This crazy bid comes to us from the great state of Washington, not to be confused with the district. This is something that is kind of one of my passions, actually. So build a kayak a lot.
You do kayak.
Matter of fact, I have a kayak in my office right now.
So who doesn't?
Yeah, that's what I said. That's what I said until the building people said something. But anyway.
You're just ready for the next flood.
I don't know why I said that out loud. Anyway, so this bid is, it's for the tribal sovereignty. I really, really am not as dumb as I sound, okay? The tribal sovereignty training, lesson development, and website editing. And you try to say that. Okay. Anyway, so basically this bid is for someone to come up with curriculum for K through 12, basically, and each level has a different set of curriculum. Curricula. Anyway, for multiple curriculums, and it's basically over the history of Native Americans, and not really that specifically to the state of Washington, which they didn't really have any major tribes there. So anyway, so I go kayaking a lot with my friends, and we all hunt for like Indian artifacts and stuff, because here in Austin, literally you find them, and I found one in Braden's driveway at his wedding.
People don't know who Braden is.
I know, but I'm just telling you. And sure, Braden the Great.
Okay, now they know who he is.
No, from season 1.
Yeah.
He's the guy that gets me all the crazy bids. Or used to, Braden. Anyway, you can find them all over around here. And when you kayak, you find yourself in some pretty cool spots, that you look down and there's arrowheads, right? I've read like a whole lot of books. I'm realizing how that sounds. I read a whole lot of books.
You learned good.
I learned real good. But no, I've read a whole lot of books.
You're one of those fancy book people.
I know it. And I've never owned a Kindle, by the way. Paper. Anyway, so I read a lot of books on the history of Native Americans in Central Texas, as well as, nationwide. And one time, I actually got paid to be a consultant on Native Americans in Central Texas. The problem was, it was for the freakiest people of any, subsect out there. Okay, war recreation people. Do you know any?
I've seen
from afar.
Yeah, from afar. Right?
Yeah, they're okay. They're as bad as the Renaissance people. They're so into it. But anyway, I just wanted to say I got paid to be a consultant on a historical thing. Blah blah blah. So I know my stuff well enough to where I actually have a CV I can put in, which I'm going to win this bid, by the way. So. That's it. It's not really a crazy bid so much. It's just one that's
different.
Yeah, and it's something near and dear to my heart. And the history of the Native Americans, by the way, should not be understated. And if I were able to have Marlon Brando say this for me right now to you, I would do so.
Very good. Well, this has been a busy show. Obviously, having Dr. Clarke on, and now that crazy / interesting bid. Jim and I and everybody here at the show, we want to pass along to you and yours a very happy 4th of July. Fly that flag often, friends, and proudly. You can make our 4th even better by downloading, sharing, and following the Big Bid Theory. Send the emails. As a matter of fact, in the not-so-distant future, we will have the mailbag segment where Jim and I address some of your questions and comments. My email is bcolhane@bidprime.com. Jim's email address is jward@bidprime.com. At The Big Bit Theory is our Twitter. Much appreciation for following us, liking, and retweeting our brilliance. Jim's on Twitter as Jim Ward, the number 6. I'm contract_Hunter. Jim, have a great 4th, partner. Any final parting shots?
Bang. That's it.
Thank you. The terrorists win if you live in fear, cower in the corner, play nice, or don't educate yourself on what in the hell is going on with terrorism. Stay tuned next time for part 2 with Dr. Clarke. For Jim, our patriotic and damn proud to be American, the Big Bit Theory staff, thank you again to Dr. Colin Clarke. Until the fireworks are all used up and hot dogs have been eaten, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, and Bobcats, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Go Gunners and arson, spend some money, please.
We're having so much fun.